And the young staffer who was writing those memoranda was an economist named Robert Mundell, who had recently got his PhD under Paul Samuelson, who was on the Kennedy team from MIT. Robert Mundell would go on to be the founder of supply-side economics and Ronald Reagan's economic guru. And he was the one who influenced Kennedy in 1961. Kennedy heard this and informed his own counsel, I want to do the exact opposite. And you know what else he told his own counsel? I'll give you all the credit if you accept this switch. And they said, okay. And so Walter Heller died in 1987, and Paul Samuelson, who died just last December, he always accepted all the accolades. Oh, that great 60s boom, yeah, we said tight money, cut taxes, and yeah, that happened, and aren't we the greatest economists who ever lived? The documentary record, I've seen all the documents at the Kennedy Library, is clear as a bell. Kennedy put a gun to their head, just said, I'm reversing your policy mix. I will permit you to accept credit if you accept it. I said, okay, Mr. President. That's documentary fact. I mean, I go about a bit in this book, but let me assure you that's what caused the great 1960s boom. From 1962 to 1968, we had a reversion of the trend of the 19th century, 5% growth per year. Inflation went down to 0 by 1965. And unemployment was beneath 4% the entire latter half of the 1960s. One of the greatest runs in economic history. Tax cuts, huge tax cut, reduced the marginal rate of the income tax by 21%. The federal funds rate increased 300%. Tight money in tax cuts. The federal funds rate was tripled, plus a reduction in income tax. It's the exact opposite of the policy mix which Barack Obama's economic team has given us. It created the greatest boom of the 20th century. So as of 1969, we still have not one single year in which there has been positive economic growth that was not associated with the stepping back of the Federal Reserve and the income tax, since those two institutions from 1913 were created, and we're never going to find one. From 1969 to 1973, well, this was the worst protracted economic mess the United States had ever experienced outside of the Great Depression itself. I mean, these were the stagflation years, and heck, a third of my book, and it goes through, it's some heavy reading, but a third of this book is a narrative history of the stagflation mess that the United States got involved with in the 1970s. This is when inflation averaged 9% per year. This is when there were 3 consecutive double-dip recessions. We're worried about having a double-dip recession right now. There are 3 of them in the 1970s, 1969, 1971, 1974, 1975, 1980, 1982. And the price level increased threefold. Now, however bad our recession has been these days, and it's been bad, 5 down economic quarters, we had that in 1974, 1975, and in 1980, 82. What if all these unemployed today, 9.6% unemployment, we had 10.8% unemployment in 1982, and we had 9% unemployment in 1974? What if those unemployed had to face prices that were 3 times higher than they were a couple years ago? Make being unemployed even more dastardly than it is now. So all this stuff about the worst recession since the Great Depression, we should take with a grain of salt. One of the reasons the Obamonomics people are so interested in calling it the worst recession since the Great Depression is they don't want to call attention to how the stagflationary 1970s were solved. Because if you said this is the worst recession since the 1970s, people would say, well, how'd they end that thing? Oh, we know how they ended that thing. They ended that by tightening money and cutting taxes. But if you say it's the worst recession since the Great Depression, then people say, oh yeah, how was the Great Depression solved? That wasn't it those big public works programs and tax on business? And even though that's not true, that's not how the Great Depression was solved. The Great Depression was solved by the Federal Reserve's recommitment to gold in 1944 and the tax cut of 1947-48. So no. The record is very clear that the 1970s include at least 2 double-dip recessions as bad or worse. I think it's still the case that the 80-82 recession is worse than the one we have right now. And boy, was that stuff eliminated by supply-side economics, by tax cuts and tightened money. Let me just tell a few stories about the 70s. I mean, they're really kind of gross. I don't want to ruin your evening too much. But the stock market lost 75% of its real value in the 1970s. The Dow Jones Industrial Average first hit 1,000 in 1966, January of 1966, 1,000. It was at 770 in August of 1982. Okay, that's 16 years later. And meanwhile, the price level had increased by 300%. So that means that Stocks, just to stay at par, should have been at 3,000, and they were at 772 after 16 years. And you talk about a 401k. I mean, just forget about saving money. And if some of your money got paid out in dividends, let's say you stayed in the market the whole time or paid dividends, you know what the marginal rate of income tax on stock dividends was? It was 50%. The capital gains rate was 50%. I beg your pardon, the marginal rate of taxes on dividends was 70%, 7-0. The capital gains rate was 50%. So let's say you have a stock that's just increasing at the rate of inflation. You buy a stock and it increases at 10% per year. Well, that's the rate of inflation. Prices are going up by 10% per year. So your stock triples over this period. That means you've seen no real increase because everything costs 3 times as much. That increase, let's say your stock goes from $100 to $300, that increase of $200 will be hit with a capital gains tax of 50%. So if your stock increases at the rate of inflation, at the end you have 2/3 as much money as you had at the beginning. That is how inflation interacts with the tax code. You can imagine what this did to things like business investment, entrepreneurialism, job creation, animal spirits. Let's get out there and start a business. No chance. If you plunk money down in investment that's going to create jobs and you see profits come in at the rate of inflation, those are all gone to the tax man. You have to do something like make 2, 3, 4 times the rate of inflation just to break even. This is why all sorts of huge businesses decided we are getting completely out of the investment business and we are going to buy access to commodities that keep up with inflation. The best example, US Steel, biggest employer in the country. What does it do? Sets aside the $6 billion it was going to devote to modernizing its plants in the late 1970s, buys an oil company, Marathon Oil. Why? Because oil naturally goes up with the price of inflation. And so you just see layoffs, 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 layoffs. Investment strike, which is, this is precisely the history we are now recapitulating. You can't demonize business and say, you know, we're going to raise taxes, all that stuff. Business will simply withdraw into inflation hedges. It's precisely what's happening today. If we're looking for a libretto, if we're looking for a history of what happens, well, we have it in the 1970s. You just see chronic 10, 11, 12% unemployment with nobody being able to save money, no investments working out. I mean, you can buy gold, sure. Gold went from $35 to $840 an ounce, right? But then gold crashed. And Ron Paul, I heard Ron Paul, Congressman Paul, speak at Jeremy Davis's symposium a couple months ago in Houston. And he said, he doesn't have perfect evidence for this, but he thinks that the federal government gets so angry at people for buying gold, because when the gold price goes up, it's so embarrassing to the Federal Reserve, that once gold starts going down, the Federal Reserve really tries to accelerate it, to punish people who embarrass the Fed beforehand. He thinks that's a little trickery that goes on. The federal government, that sure as heck would happen to gold in the 1980s.